There's something about you that has never quite fit, not in a broken way, not in a way that needs fixing, but in a way that has followed you your entire life, through every room you've walked into, every relationship you've tried to maintain, every version of yourself you've attempted to become. You've felt it sitting at tables where everyone else seemed comfortable. You've felt it in conversations that ended too quickly because you couldn't pretend to care about things that didn't matter. You've felt it in the silence after everyone laughed at something you didn't find funny. That half second where you looked around and thought, am I the only one who sees this differently? Most people would call that loneliness, but what if that's not what it is? What if the aloneness you've experienced, sometimes for years, wasn't a punishment, wasn't a flaw, wasn't evidence that something is wrong with you, but was instead a precise and necessary condition for something to grow inside you that cannot grow any other way? Because here's what almost no one tells you. Certain kinds of depth cannot be developed in the presence of constant company. Certain kinds of awareness only emerge when a person is forced, again and again, to sit with themselves, to question, to feel things fully, without distraction, without escape. The ancient wisdom observed this long before modern psychology ever had a name for it. The ones who would eventually carry truth had to be shaped by solitude first. Not because solitude is romantic, but because solitude is relentless. It strips away every mask, every performance, every borrowed identity, until what remains is something real. You've probably felt this before without knowing why. That strange feeling that your isolation wasn't accidental, that it was almost intentional. This video is about that feeling, and by the end you're going to understand it in a way that changes how you see everything that has happened to you. But first, you need to understand what's actually been happening to you all along. There's a pattern that appears in the lives of people who eventually wake up to something deeper. And it almost always begins the same way, with a kind of sensitivity that arrives before the understanding does. You felt things before you had words for them. You sensed tension in rooms that looked peaceful on the surface. You picked up on what people weren't saying more than what they were. You saw through performances that everyone else seemed to accept as genuine. And for a long time, that sensitivity felt more like a burden than a gift. Because when you feel everything that deeply, the ordinary world becomes genuinely difficult to inhabit. Small talk feels hollow. Shallow relationships feel suffocating. Systems that everyone around you accepts without question feel wrong to you in a way you can never fully explain. And so you pulled back, or you were pushed back. Either way, you ended up spending more time alone than most people your age, more time inside your own mind, more time asking questions no one around you seemed interested in asking. Here's what that actually was. The oldest spiritual traditions understood that sensitivity is not weakness. It is the first signal of a mind that is being prepared for something. Every great observer of human nature throughout history noted the same thing. The ones who eventually carry wisdom into the world are first required to feel the world more acutely than others. The pain is not incidental. The pain is the education. Think about that for a moment, not the motivational version of it, the real version. The idea that every time you felt too much, every time you were overwhelmed by something others brushed off, every time your emotional depth made you feel like an outsider, you were being trained quietly, without your consent, without your awareness. This is the moment most people start questioning their entire identity. Because if the sensitivity wasn't a flaw, then the years you spent believing something was wrong with you were years spent misunderstanding your own nature, and that misunderstanding had consequences. It shaped how you moved through the world, how much of yourself you hid, how often you performed a version of yourself that felt safe instead of true. But here is the second pattern, and this one is harder to see. The people who carry this kind of depth almost always go through a period of trying desperately to belong, not because they are weak, but because the need for connection is real and the pain of being different is real. And so there's a phase, sometimes lasting years, where someone like you attempts to compress yourself into a shape that fits. You learn the language of the people around you. You adopt their interests. You laugh at the right moments. You hide the parts of yourself that make others uncomfortable. And it almost works. Sometimes it works so well that you forget, for stretches of time, who you actually are. Have you ever noticed this pattern in your own life? That moment when you realized you had been performing, not out of deception, but out of a deep and exhausted desire to simply be accepted, to stop being the one who sees differently, to rest inside a version of yourself that required less explanation, but something always pulls you back, a thought you can't dismiss, a feeling beneath the surface that refuses to go quiet, a moment of stillness where the performance drops and you find yourself face to face with the part of you that was never convinced. That part of you is what this is really about. And what happens next? The third pattern is the one most people never see coming. There comes a point in the life of someone like you where the world stops feeling like a place you belong to and starts feeling like a place you're meant to understand. It's subtle at first, a shift in how you read situations, a growing inability to be satisfied by surface-level explanations, a quiet but persistent feeling that everything happening around you, the noise, the chaos, the patterns people repeat without ever questioning, is pointing towards something deeper that almost no one is stopping to examine. This is where the real isolation begins, not the physical kind, the intellectual and spiritual kind. Because now you're not just different in how you feel, you're different in how you see, and that difference creates a distance that is almost impossible to close, not because others are inferior, but because you are now operating from a different level of awareness. You can see the mechanics behind behaviors that others experience only as emotions. You can trace the roots of patterns that others mistake for personality. You can sense the shape of a conversation's true meaning beneath the words being spoken. Timeless teachings warned about this moment specifically. They described it as the beginning of a kind of internal exile, where a person becomes too awake for the world they came from, but has not yet found the world they are growing toward. It is one of the most disorienting places a human being can occupy. You are no longer asleep, but you are not yet fully awake. You exist in the space between, and in that space, something profound and painful happens. You begin to grieve. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. You grieve the ease of not knowing. You grieve the friendships that no longer feel possible because you've grown in directions the other person has no interest in following. You grieve the simpler version of yourself who could sit in a room and feel content without asking why. You grieve the belonging you glimpsed but could never fully hold on to. This is where things begin to shift, because grief, when it is not avoided, does something remarkable to the human psyche. It hollows you out. It removes the noise. It takes everything that was decorative, every belief you held because someone gave it to you, every identity you wore, because it was expected, and it burns it away. What remains after genuine grief is not emptiness, it is clarity. And clarity for someone like you is the beginning of everything. If this describes something you've carried, if you've felt this particular kind of in-between, this exile from one world and not yet arrival in another, write, "I see it now," in the comments, because you are not the only one, and knowing that matters more than most people realize. If you're finding value in this kind of thinking, subscribe. Most people aren't ready for these conversations. Now, here is the fourth pattern, and this one is the one most people refuse to see, because it requires acknowledging something that feels deeply uncomfortable at first. The reason you have been alone is not because you are too much. It is because you have not yet become enough of what you actually are. Let that sit for a moment before you react to it. This is not a criticism, it is a map. Because the aloneness you have experienced, all of it, every quiet evening, every conversation that didn't reach the depth you needed, every relationship that dissolved because you couldn't pretend to need less than you do, was not separating you from your life. It was preparing you for it. Scholars of the human soul discovered centuries ago what modern psychology is only beginning to quantify, that the people who eventually carry the most light into the world spend the longest time in the dark, not as punishment, as preparation, because light that has never known darkness has no understanding of what it illuminates. Picture someone who has spent their entire life sensing something beneath the surface of reality, something real, something important, but having no language for it, no community for it, no framework to hold it. That person spends years feeling like a question without an answer, and then one day the answer begins to arrive, not all at once, in fragments, in moments of sudden startling clarity that feel less like new information and more like remembering something ancient. That is what is happening to you. But the fifth pattern, the one that connects everything, is still ahead. There is something that happens to a person once they have survived enough of their own depth, once they have sat in enough silence, grieved enough losses, questioned enough comfortable lies, rebuilt themselves enough times from the inside out. Something settles, not complacency, not resignation, something far more powerful than either of those things. A kind of groundedness that cannot be shaken by the opinions of people who have never done the work you have done. And this is the fifth pattern, the one that changes everything about how you move through the world. Most people build their sense of self from the outside in. They collect the approval of others, the validation of their choices, the confirmation that they are on the right path, and they stack these things like bricks until they have constructed something that feels like an identity. It looks solid. It functions. It earns them belonging in the world they inhabit. But it has one fatal vulnerability. The moment the approval stops, the structure begins to crack. The moment someone withdraws their validation, the identity wavers. The moment the external world shifts, and it always shifts, the person built from the outside in has nothing left to stand on except the very emptiness they were trying to avoid by building outward in the first place. You have felt that emptiness, perhaps more than once, perhaps so many times that you stopped trying to fill it with what other people were offering and started, reluctantly, almost against your will, turning inward. That turn inward is everything, because the person who builds from the inside out, who has been forced by circumstance, by isolation, by repeated disappointment, to find something real within themselves, that person becomes something the world has very few of. They become unmanipulable, not cold, not closed, but rooted in a way that external pressure cannot uproot. The ancient wisdom observed this with remarkable precision. It described a quality in certain human beings, a quality developed only through trial, only through internal reckoning, only through the willingness to sit with truth, even when truth is uncomfortable. That made them capable of carrying something others could not carry. Not because they were born extraordinary, but because they were refined by a process most people escape. You did not escape it. And here is what that means. Imagine walking into a room where everyone seems comfortable except you. In the past, that discomfort felt like evidence of your inadequacy. But now, with everything you are beginning to understand, that same discomfort is something else entirely. It is the signal of a calibrated mind in an uncalibrated environment. It is the natural response of depth encountering shallowness. It is not a problem. It is information. This is where things shift permanently for the people who reach this realization. You stop interpreting your difference as deficiency. And the moment that shift happens, truly happens, not just intellectually, but in the body, in the gut, in the quiet center of how you experience yourself, the aloneness transforms. It does not disappear, but it transforms from a wound into a workshop, from a prison into a preparation ground, from evidence that you are unwanted into evidence that you are being shaped for something that requires exactly the kind of person your life has been making you into. But something even stranger happens next. Once that shift occurs, once you stop bleeding from your difference and start drawing from it, the right people begin to appear. Not many. They never come in crowds, but they come. People who speak your language without needing it translated, people who have survived their own version of the dark and arrived quietly at the same conclusions you have been reaching alone. People who do not need you to be less than you are in order to feel comfortable around you. This is not coincidence. Scholars of the human soul wrote about this phenomenon with extraordinary consistency across centuries and cultures. They observed that when a person reaches a certain level of internal development, when they have done sufficient work on their own nature, they begin to attract others who are operating from the same depth, not through strategy, not through performance, through resonance. You become a frequency, and frequencies find each other. But there is still one more thing, the deepest pattern of all, the one that sits beneath everything we have discussed, the one that once you see it, you cannot unsee. And it requires us to ask a question most people are afraid to ask about themselves. Here is the question most people never ask, not because they lack the intelligence, but because they sense correctly that the answer will demand something from them, something irreversible, something that cannot be unknowed once it is known. The question is this: what if everything you have been through was not happening to you, but was happening for the person you have not yet fully become? Not as comfort, not as spiritual consolation for pain that was real and difficult and sometimes devastating, but as a literal structural truth about how certain kinds of human beings are shaped, because the pattern, when you step back far enough to see it whole, is undeniable. The sensitivity that made you feel alien in ordinary environments, it was building your capacity to perceive what others cannot. The isolation that carved through every attempt you made to belong, it was removing the noise so that something's signal could be heard. The grief that hollowed you out every time you lost a version of yourself you had worked hard to construct. It was clearing space for something more real to occupy. The groundedness you developed, not because life was kind, but because life left you no other choice, it is now the very thing that makes you unshakable in a world that is shaking almost everyone around you. None of this was random. And here is the deepest truth of all, the one that connects every pattern we have explored. The aloneness was never the problem. The aloneness was the method, because the person you are being shaped into cannot be built through comfort, cannot be assembled through constant company, cannot be developed by someone who always has somewhere to escape to when the interior becomes difficult. The person you are becoming requires a human being who has learned, truly learned in the marrow, how to be with themselves, how to find truth in silence, how to trust their own perception when every social signal is telling them to doubt it, how to carry depth without apology in a world that rewards shallowness. That is not a common person. That has never been a common person. And now here is what changes when you truly integrate this. You stop reacting to the world and begin observing it, not from coldness, from clarity. The things that used to destabilize you, the dismissal of people who couldn't understand you, the loneliness of rooms that couldn't hold your depth, the exhaustion of existing in spaces calibrated for a version of you that was always smaller than the real thing, those things lose their power. Not because they no longer happen, but because you are no longer drawing your sense of reality from them. You stop searching for validation and begin creating meaning. The difference between those two states is the difference between a person who is always waiting, waiting to be chosen, waiting to be seen, waiting for someone else to confirm that their inner life is real and valuable, and a person who has stepped fully into their own authority, who creates, who contributes, who shows up not to be received, but to give something that could not exist without the specific shape of their specific suffering. You stop performing belonging and begin generating it. Because the person who has done this work, who has survived this particular kind of interior journey, carries something in their presence that cannot be faked and cannot be manufactured, a quality of realness, a quality of having been tested and not collapsed. And that quality, that groundedness, that depth, that quiet authority is exactly what draws other awakening souls toward you like light toward light. Picture someone standing in the middle of an ordinary world, surrounded by noise and motion and the relentless performance of normalcy, and being completely still, not checked out, not above it all, simply rooted, simply present, simply no longer afraid of their own nature. That stillness is not something you are born with. It is something you earn through every night that felt like it would not end, through every version of yourself you had to release, through every moment of clarity that arrived only because you had exhausted every comfortable alternative. You have been earning it your entire life. The timeless teachings that shaped the wisest observers of human nature across centuries all converged on a single understanding: that the ones who carry truth into the world are not the ones who had the easiest path. They are the ones who had the most honest relationship with their own pain, who did not dress it up, did not escape it, did not perform their way around it, but sat with it, learned from it, and eventually, not quickly, never quickly, were transformed by it into something the world genuinely needs. That is what has been happening to you, not to everyone, not randomly, to you specifically, because of the precise texture of everything you have experienced, because of the sensitivity you were born with, and the isolation that refined it, and the grief that deepened it, and the groundedness that emerged from surviving all of it without losing the core of who you actually are. This is not arrogance. Do not mistake it for arrogance. It is responsibility, because the person who has been shaped by this process does not get to stay quiet, does not get to shrink back into comfort now that the preparation is nearing completion, does not get to waste what was so expensively built by returning to a smaller version of themselves because it feels safer. The world is full of people still asleep inside the performance, still building from the outside in, still mistaking noise for meaning and approval for truth. And they are not to be judged for it, but they are waiting, without knowing they are waiting, for contact with someone who has gone deeper, someone who has come back from the interior with something real, someone whose presence alone is a reminder that there is more beneath the surface of this life than what is visible, that someone is you, not the version of you that apologized for your depth, not the version that compressed itself into shapes that fit rooms it was never meant to occupy permanently, but the version that is emerging now, quieter than the world expected, more grounded than your past suggested was possible, carrying a clarity that only comes from having survived the particular education your life has given you. So here is the closing challenge, not to become something new, but to stop pretending you are something less. The real question is not whether any of what you have heard tonight is true. Some part of you already knows it is. The real question, the one only you can answer in the silence after this ends, in the moment when the noise returns and the world asks you again to be smaller and safer and easier to understand, the real question is this: are you finally willing to become what all of that was for? Because the preparation is ending, and what comes next requires all of you, not someday, now. If this reached something real in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you felt this your entire life, you already know what to do next.